You can open your Bibles to Mark 14 tonight. Mark chapter 14. As I was looking at, Matthew 14. Mark 14 is great as well, but you'll be lost if you're in Mark 14. Lost in terms of the lesson. I noticed as I was looking at each of the lessons, the ones except for mine really do relate water to salvation very directly. Naaman was cleansed literally by water, of course, by God and obeying His commands, and I'm sure that was discussed. I saw that you were going to talk about Philip and the eunuch. Of course, that relates to water in a very direct way to salvation. And my lesson, however, has water as one of its central ideas, but not directly as it relates to salvation. And I was given this lesson sort of with no specific direction in which to go, so I hope I do it well. When I get a topic, I just pretty much run with it and do what I like, and so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to treat it sort of in a textual way. That is, we're going to study the text and the context of it, what leads up to it, and then we'll march our way through it. And we're going to talk about 5 or 6 different points here tonight, and we're going to start with sort of an extended context of what's going on here in Matthew chapter 14. There is some mourning going on. You can pick up in verse 1. Matthew 14, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus, and said unto his servants, This is John the Baptist, he's risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. And then we have a bit of a flashback. Beginning in verse number 3, it says, For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. For John had said, verse 4, It is not lawful for thee to have her. John stood up very strongly and very soundly there, and for that, when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she asks, at her mother's request, for John the Baptist's head and a charger. Well, that's exactly what happens. Herod beheads John. Now, how does that apply to what we're going to talk about and to the context that eventually leads us to Jesus and Peter walking on water? Well, look at Jesus' reaction. After, in verse 12, his disciples came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Well, what was Jesus' response? In verse number 13, when Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. Can't you imagine if someone that you were very close to, you learned that they had passed away, and especially under the circumstances by which this happened, wouldn't you want to do maybe what Jesus did? I've just got to get away for a little bit. I've got to separate myself, and I'm going to get away. Well, Jesus attempts to do that, but notice what happens in verse 13. When the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. He couldn't even get away. They were so desirous to see him that he couldn't even separate himself in the smallest way and mourn for his friend and for his fellow worker in the kingdom that would come. But that's not the only reason. You see, it's very interesting. The events that surround Peter walking on water are mentioned in all 4 of the gospel accounts. Now, they don't all mention Peter walking on water, but the feeding with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, that shows up in each of the gospel accounts. And I'd like you to turn for just a moment to John chapter 6. And let's look at John's account of these same events as they are transpiring. Why is Jesus in a state of mourning? Well, one reason is John's death. He had passed away, Jesus heard of it, and he was mourning the death of John. But there are other reasons as well. As we mentioned, Jesus, as he has just done, has fed the 5,000. And he's done that with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, a great example, a great demonstration of Jesus' power. Well then, after this happens in John chapter 6, I want you to notice the response, verse 22. The day following, when the people which stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there, save the one where his disciples were entered, Jesus would not with his disciples into the boat, but that his disciples were gone away. Verse 24, when the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, they also took shipping and came to Capernaum seeking for Jesus. Notice, they will not leave Him alone. He sent the disciples away, and He's separate, and they are actively trying to find Him, turning over every stone, looking under every leaf, trying to find Jesus. Well, when they had found Him, verse 25, on the other side of the sea, they said unto Him, Rabbi, when camest Thou thither? Maybe you read this and you think, oh, they want to hear Jesus preach. Oh, look at how sincere these people are. But Jesus knew different. Notice what He says there in verse 26. Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek Me not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. That was their reaction. Now, this was all stemming from their immense fervor that they had at what He had done. In verse 15, it says, when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take Him by force to make Him a king, He departed again into a mountain Himself alone. So another reason He needed to be alone was because of just how intense these people had become. Now, why did they want to make Jesus a king? I'm going to treat this like a Bible class. I hope that's okay. So you're allowed to speak. Why did they want to make Jesus a king? Why was this such a big deal? The Jewish mindset of the day was that when the Messiah came, He was going to establish an earthly kingdom. Yes. You go all the way to Acts chapter 1 and you'll see that. Go to Acts 1 with me and notice what these disciples believe. This is the apostles of Jesus. And if the apostles believed this, then we can rest assured that the common man certainly believed this too. In verse 6, Jesus has already been crucified and has already risen again, and He's about to ascend into heaven later on in this chapter. In verse 6, when they therefore were come together, they, the apostles, asked Him, saying, Lord, wilt Thou at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel? They were thinking that Jesus was going to ride in on a massive steed, and He was going to establish an earthly kingdom, and He was going to be the earthly king. But you know what else? If He's the earthly king, what are the apostles going to be? Oh, they can be princes, right? Remember that John and James asked that they have special places on the side of Jesus when He enters into His kingdom. They saw fame and fortune in this. Well, the common man saw deliverance. We won't have to be Roman subjects anymore. Jesus will ride in and He'll deliver us. And so look what they're doing in John 6. They're trying to take Him and by force make Him a king, an earthly king. Violently, if necessary, make Him a king. And so Jesus said, I've got to get away. So He's mourning because of the loss of John. He's in distress emotionally because of the fervor. And then their responses, He says, look, you don't even really care about the message I'm preaching, do you? You know what you care about? You care about physical deliverance from Rome, and you care about food. Now, I love food. I enjoy it so much. You said, is there food after this tonight? Oh, of course there is. Every excuse we can have to eat is great. I preached a meeting at Fairfield in Bell Buckle, and if you ever have a chance to go for the gospel meeting, I recommend you do it on a Sunday. Because they have the meal. And they had this really long, and I'm not exaggerating, the buffet table started here and ended at the door. Did you say that's about right? And it was arranged according to color. All of the yellow casseroles were here, and I'm not joking. Danielle can attest to this. And then you moved on into the greens. But by the time I got to the greens, my plate was full. I was really disappointed. And then the meats, for some reason, were like third or fourth on the list, but they were down there kind of at the pole there. And then it went into the salads and the other sort of things like that. And then a whole other table was the desserts. Like, I love to eat. But the people who listened to Jesus and were fed by Him cared about nothing else but being fed and being physically delivered. They didn't care about their souls. And so Jesus had a heavy heart. He had a heavy heart because John was dead. He had a heavy heart because the people wanted more than anything else to physically take Him by force and make Him a king. And He had to get away. And then He had a heavy heart because these people didn't really care about their souls at all. They just cared about their bellies, and they cared about their bank accounts, and they cared about their politics. But they didn't really care about God and about salvation. Not really. And so He's got a heavy heart. He is mourning. So what does he want to do? He wants to get away. Southwest had this ad campaign for a number of years, right? The Want to Get Away fairs. And so they would have these really embarrassing things that happen to people, and then ding, want to get away. And so you can fly out of the area, for $200 to so-and-so place. Jesus wanted to get away from all of the pressure. And so we move next to the meditation. And so you look at Matthew 14 again. That's our text, right? We're going to bounce around to some of the companion texts in the other gospel accounts, but our main text is Matthew 14. And I want you to look at verse 13. When Jesus heard of it, that is, he heard of the death of John the Baptist, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. He went away. Now the people followed him, and he never had a chance to rest and to relax. And I want you to notice, let's continue in verse 13. When the people heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. In verse 14 it says, and Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude. Now, put yourself in the shoes of Jesus. Let's imagine you've been working literally all year long without a vacation. Many of you do that, right? Maybe you have 1 or 2 vacations a year, and you plan those ahead of time. Maybe you have to elbow the guy in front of you in the PR office or the HR office because you're going to get your time put in stone a year in advance. And it comes time for your vacation, and you get in the car and you take off, and you no sooner than step foot in your cabin or your hotel or your whatever it is, and all of a sudden you're flooded with work. What do? You turn off your phone, you say, I don't care. What if it's people in desperate need of your help and your assistance? Look, I'm on vacation. I want you to notice what Jesus did here in verse 14. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion towards them, and he healed their sick. Did Jesus have a chance to get away? No. He tried to get away and they followed him. So what did he do? He healed them anyway. He didn't say, go away, I'm trying to rest. Don't you see how heavy my heart is now? Don't you see what I'm going through? He didn't. He continued his work. He absolutely did. And I just want you to file that away. We're going to notice that a little bit later on. He continued his work. In verse 22 of chapter 14, and straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship. I read one commentator, I always wondered, why did Jesus send them away? One commentator mentioned the fact that they were trying to violently make him king, and he said, you know what I think? I think Jesus put his apostles in a ship so they wouldn't get carried away by the mob and get swept into the mob mentality of making Jesus a king. It was this great temptation that he knew they already were a part of themselves. And he said, I got to get them out of here. Evacuate them from the temptation. Abstain from all appearance of evil. That's what he was doing. And so he ships his disciples literally off into the middle of the water. And verse 23, when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. Finally, Jesus gets some time to himself. Do we need time to ourselves? Do we need time apart and away? For those of you who have, and I'm not saying all jobs are not important, but for those of you who have jobs in the public service arena, in particular things like first responders, doctors, nurses, these jobs where people's lives are at stake, or preachers and elders and all of those individuals who spiritually are in a similar situation, we feel this pressure to never, ever take off, to never separate ourselves from our work. But even Jesus took some time. Do you know, and this is usually a plague for men who will never, ever not work. And their wives are begging, please take some time off. No, I can't. I've got obligations. I've got responsibilities. If our Savior was willing and needed some time and space to himself, don't you think we do? I think we absolutely do. And so Jesus took some time off. He went into a mountain apart to pray. By the way, what time are we over in here? Quarter till 9? Very good. I appreciate you giving me that much time. So there's the meditation. Now, we're going to spend some time, a good bit of time, on the miracle. Notice first some facts about the setting. Let's pick up in verse 24. So he is in the mountain apart, and he's praying. But in verse 24, the ship is in the midst of the sea. What sea is this, by the way? Yeah, Sea of Galilee. Thank you. This is the Sea of Galilee. I'm told in my studies that the Sea of Galilee is 6 to 7 miles wide at its widest point. Now, it's much longer than it is wide, but 6 to 7 miles wide. I'm also told that it is some 130 to 148 feet deep at its deepest point, which would be in the middle where the Jordan River had created that gash in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And that'll come into play here in just a moment. But notice in 14:24 it says, "The ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary." Now, if you hold your fingers there, and you don't have to go to John 6:19, but John 6:19 tells us the distance, 25 to 30 furlongs. Matthew says he was in the midst of the sea. John says 25 to 30 furlongs away. That's about 3 miles. Well, doesn't that make sense? What's half of 6 or 7? Around 3. And so they are quite literally in the middle of the sea when all of this is going on. They're not at the shore. They're not near the shore. They're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee when all of this is going on. Now verse 25. "And in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea." There were 4 watches divided into 3 hours at a time. It started at 6 p.m. and it continued. And the 4th and final, or the 4th watch, was this watch from 3 in the morning to 6. From 3 to 6 in the morning. This is the 4th watch. This is the early morning hours. So what has Jesus been doing this whole time? He's been praying. Separated from everybody. He's been praying. Apparently, what have the apostles been doing? They've been in the middle of a boat. What is beginning to happen in that ship in the middle of the sea? Hey, why are they getting scared? There's a storm. Yes. Here's the situation. Now, when I revisited this text as I was preparing for this lesson, one of my goals was to find out, okay, how bad is the storm? Because there are storms, and then there are storms, right? And if it's just a little lightning or thunder, not a big deal. If it's a storm, well, that's much different. Well, let's look at the language and see if we can find out. "And when the disciples," or at verse 24, look at verse 24. "But the ship was now in the midst of the sea," and then it says that they were tossed by the waves. That word tossed indicates that there's some violence going on. But hold your finger there and go to Mark 6. Mark 6 describes the same event. Again, parallel to Matthew chapter 14, to Luke chapter 9, and John chapter 6. But here in Mark chapter 6, you've got another view of the same event. Verse 47 of Mark 6 says, "When evening was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land." Well, that's in other words what Matthew said, right? He was in a mountain apart praying, and then the 4th watch came in the early morning is when he decided to go to them. And now verse 48, notice it says, "He saw them toiling and rowing." Toiling and rowing. So we see that these events are taking place, and we're going to see just how severe this storm was even more in just a minute when we look at the miracle itself. But they're having trouble. And he looks out there and he can see that they are toiling and that they are rowing. And here's something else very interesting if you look at Mark's account. In verse 48 it says, "He saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the 4th watch of the night he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them." He would have passed by them. I read that and I thought, what in the world does that mean? And one commentary I was reading referenced Luke 24:28. Would someone like to read Luke 24:28 for us? This is on the road to Emmaus, as Jesus, unbeknownst to these people, is walking with these 2 individuals, and they don't know who he is. Somebody read Luke 24 and verse 48 or verse 28 for us, please.
"And they drew nigh unto the village whither they went, and had made as though he would have gone further."
Made as though he would have gone further. Well, what does that mean? Jesus sort of made the made an attempt to move on. Now, he didn't intend to keep walking, but he wanted them to think that he was going to keep walking. It was an attempt to kind of feel out where they were. Okay, and what did those people end up saying in Luke 24? No, he said, well, why don't you stay with us, right? They tried to constrain him to stay. Here, when it says that Jesus would have passed by them, I think it's a very similar thing. Jesus came out for the purpose of being with them. But he's sort of pretending or sort of giving on that he would walk by or that he would pass by to sort of see what they do. What is their reaction going to be? How are they going to respond to this situation? And so that's exactly what he does. Now, what is he doing in particular? And this is amazing. He performed a miracle in which he walked on water. Have you really just stopped to think how really impressive that miracle is? Now, we can't really rank Jesus' miracles in terms of impressiveness because they're all impressive. The fact that they're a miracle means that they circumvent natural laws that you and I can't go against. But Jesus walked on water. Have any of you ever fallen out of a boat? You ever stood up on a boat to try to do something and then somebody shook the boat on purpose or an accident? And you take that step, don't you wish that you could have done what Jesus did? But we can't, right? The laws of gravity, the surface tension, and all of the things that go into science about how water works, all of those things prevent us from being able to do that. But Jesus did it with absolutely no problem. And some might try to get around this in some physical way. But remember, how deep was the sea at its deepest point? It was between 100 and 148 feet deep. And where are they in the boat? In the middle, 3 miles off the shore. And so this is not some situation where Jesus was doing a sleight of hand, where Jesus sort of pretended to go out on the water and really he was skipping on the rocks or something. It just didn't work that way. Jesus performed a miracle. And an amazing miracle at that. And when you consider what was going on around him, it makes it even more amazing. I noticed that word tossed in Matthew 14 and verse 24. The word is tormented in Mark 6 and verse 48. Or it shows up in Mark 6 and verse 48 as well. It shows up in other places, for instance, Matthew 8:6 and 8:29. In Matthew 8:29, it has to do with the end result of where the demons will be when God punishes them. Hell, condemnation. The same idea here. So this isn't just some average storm going by. This is a situation where their boat is being tormented by a storm. And what is Jesus doing? Walking on the water. So He's not walking on a calm, clear, beautiful evening. He's walking on water in the middle of a storm where the boat is tossed and tormented by the waves and the wind. That's amazing. How wonderful an event would this be to witness? So that's the miracle itself. Notice how the people reacted. As was said, they thought it was a spirit. Now, obviously, these folks had superstitions just like many people do today. But Jesus obviously was not a spirit, and He lets them know that very quickly. Jesus reassured them. In Mark 6 and verse 50, it says, "For they all saw Him and were troubled, and immediately," it says, "He talked with them." I'm not a Greek scholar, but from what I can read from those who are, that indicates a familiar discussion. Jesus said, no, wait a minute. The book of Proverbs says a soft answer turns away wrath. I've learned that with my children. There are times when I want to jerk a knot in my kids' chain. Okay? I want to set them straight. But maybe in this situation, and I've learned this from my wife. My wife is so adept at this. Sometimes it's better to be softer instead of harder. And it's so hard to know the difference between that. Well, Jesus, in a very familiar and reassuring way, He said 3 things. Matthew says, he says, "Be of good cheer." Some translations translate that, "Take heart." "It is I." Now, when he said, "It is I," they automatically knew who it was. He didn't even have to say his name. There are people in your life where all you have to do is hear one word come out of their mouths and you know exactly who it is. And you hear that voice and you know exactly who it is. And imagine the comfort that they would get when they hear Jesus say, "It is I." And then he says, "Be not afraid. Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid." But then there are two groups of people, and this is where we're going to get to Peter, and we're going to get to the point of this evening. Two groups of people. We can't lose sight of all of the disciples who were there. And I'd like you to go to John or Mark's account again and look at verse 52. Verse 51 says, "He went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure and wondered." Now Mark and John, they don't include Peter walking with them. They don't include that. Here it describes all of the disciples. And notice what it says in verse 52, "For they considered not the miracle of the loaves." And then it says, "For their heart was hardened." These apostles were not in a situation where they were ready to recognize the power of Jesus. The transaction or the situation, the conversation between Jesus and these disciples indicates, number one, doubt. Doubt. If you just saw somebody with 5 loaves and 2 fishes feed 5,000, would you put anything past him? I can't understand, I can't get in the mind of the disciples how they could be so hot and cold with Jesus when they witnessed these amazing things. But on one hand, he feeds 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and on another, he walks on the water, and they don't believe it. And I can't get my mind around that, but it obviously demonstrates doubt. It certainly demonstrates fear. They didn't believe because they were too busy being afraid. "It is I, be of good cheer, be not afraid." But it indicates something else. It indicates habit. We have a tendency not to believe things that go against what we've believed for a long time. It is hard to do what? Teach an old dog new tricks. And most of us are old dogs. We are. We are. We absolutely are. And it's hard to teach us new things. And these apostles had a certain way of looking at the world. And it was nearly impossible, and seemed like in some instances, for Jesus to change their minds. Their hearts were hardened. That's an indication of habit. Doubt, fear, and habit, all of these things stood in the way. And then we have my favorite character study in the New Testament. It's Peter. Because Peter is all of us. You ever been really stubborn? That's Peter. Are you the one who always likes to speak before you think? That's Peter. Are you the know-it-all that can never be wrong? That's Peter too. Are you the one who is so convinced that they're on the right track and then you fall flat on your face? Well, that's Peter. See, all of the things that you and I struggle with are wrapped up in this guy named Peter. Yes. Yes. Now notice what Peter says. Go back to Matthew's account in Matthew chapter 14 and notice what he says. Jesus says, "Be of good cheer, it is I. Be not afraid." And Peter answered. Now did Peter say what all the other apostles are probably thinking? "Well, I don't know about this. Are we sure it's him? Man, I wish he could tell us something that would let us know that it was him." But Peter's the one that speaks up. And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it be thou." That's a statement of doubt. Now does he doubt Jesus? No, he just doesn't know for sure if it is Jesus or not. I don't know that he's doubting Jesus specifically. He's doubting whether it is Jesus in this situation. He needs proof. He needs evidence. Thomas is called Doubting Thomas because he said, "Except I put my hand in the print of the nails, except I see and feel that wound in his side, I will not believe." And I believe that there's a sense in which he's to be commended because he wanted evidence. He wanted proof. He wanted to be certain. Well, Peter's asking something very similar. "Jesus, I don't know if it's really you or not, and I need to be sure. And if it is you, bid me to come unto thee. I want you to perform this miracle as a test It's a test of who you are, and not that I believe it's you but don't think you can do it. I think Peter was convinced of Jesus' power, it seems, but in this instance, he needed to make sure it was Jesus. So that's what Peter said, "If it be thou, bid me to come unto thee on the water." And so what did Jesus say? One word, come. So what did Peter do? Let's pick up in verse 29. And he said, "Come." And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. I wonder how that felt. Can you imagine the exhilaration that you would feel? I've never done anything akin to flying. I've never parachuted. I've never done hang gliding or parasailing or anything like that. But I can imagine the rush that you would feel in that situation. I can imagine stepping out on a boat and stepping onto the water and not drowning. Would have to be an exhilarating event. Now, had the wind been blowing already? Had the storm been happening around them? Yes. I want you to pay attention though. And he said, "Come." And when Peter has come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he, number one, saw the wind was already there. But in his fervor and in his exhilaration, he had ignored the wind. And now he sees it again. Okay? He lost focus. Number two, he was afraid. He lost faith. We say, how do you know that Peter lost faith? Well, Jesus says, "O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?" He saw the wind was boisterous, and he was afraid. He lost his faith, and then he what? Beginning to sink. He lost his foundation. Yeah, are we on a hard and fast? I've got 3 till a quarter. Is that right? Y'all done some bad things to Bill. Y'all have run up that clock. You've stolen 3 minutes from him every time he gets up to preach. How dare y'all? So he lost his foundation. People today go through the same process. Everything's going great, and then they see the trouble. The trouble that's been there all the time. It's not as if life pauses trouble for everybody. Just we fail to see it sometimes. And when we finally see it, because it happens to us, or because it hits us at a vulnerable moment, we see it, we lose focus. We lose focus, we lose faith, we lose our foundation, and we start to sink. You know people that this has happened to. And before long, they are flailing because life has hit them. And that's what happened to Peter. That's what happened to Peter. Now, what did Jesus do? 2 things that Jesus did. 2 sets of things. Number 1, he stretched forth his hand and caught him. Number 1, Jesus, I'm just this kind of guy. Maybe this is what I would have done. Peter, I told you. Don't you know by now you should have faith? And maybe let him almost think, let his head get right here to prove a point. That's not at all what Jesus did. The moment Peter, it says beginning to sink, what did Jesus do? Stretched forth his hand. He was concerned about Peter. He wasn't in the business of teaching a lesson right yet. He wasn't in the business of punishing him or anything like that. Jesus reached forth his hand at the moment he had the opportunity. Concern. Number 2, aid. He didn't just reach forth his hand, he caught him. Caught him. How quickly did Peter stop sinking? Oh, the moment Jesus caught him. But then he doesn't lose an opportunity to give correction and instruction. Oh, thou of little faith. He corrects him. You don't have the faith that you need. Jesus is not going to give Peter a free pass, is he? What does he call him later? Get thee behind me, Matthew 16. What? Satan, you're an offense to me. When thou art converted, he would go on to say in Luke's account, strengthen the brethren. You're nowhere where you need to be yet, Peter. But here he says, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? He gives him correction and instruction. As we conclude, okay, 3 things that you and I can take from it. Number 1, don't get so wrapped up in your own affairs that you forget about the needs of others. Jesus, even when He was loaded down with weight and trying His best to get away, He would heal those who need healing. He would help those who needed helping. He never let Himself get wrapped up. Number 2, Jesus sees and Jesus cares. Number 3, we must focus on Christ in order to make it through the troubles that life might hand us. I appreciate your time and attention. Sorry I had to go so quickly at the end.